And breaking news is in Garden Grove, where a chemical tank is at risk of exploding. Firefighters continuing to spray it with water, trying to keep it cool. They've been doing this since yesterday at this time when the leak first began.
44,000 people are now under evacuation orders. One official here at the command post told me that if this tank explodes, it's going to be like a bomb going off. And I've talked to plenty of people today who say that this is a very real possibility if they cannot stop the leak. The other scenario would be a major catastrophic leak of the hazardous materials in this tank.
Firefighters in Southern California are still blasting thousands of gallons of water onto an overheating chemical tank that officials say could either rupture or explode. More than 50,000 people have already been evacuated. Emergency shelters are overcrowded. The tank temperature has reportedly climbed beyond the readable limit of the monitoring system. And now, a crisis that started inside one industrial facility in Garden Grove is beginning to collide with something much larger: America's F-35 fighter jet supply chain. The emergency started after a cooling system malfunction at the GKN Aerospace facility in Orange County allowed methyl methacrylate, a volatile industrial chemical known as MMA, to begin heating uncontrollably inside a storage tank. At first, local crews believed they could stabilize the situation. Then conditions worsened. The tank reportedly began venting gases. Firefighters observed structural swelling. Internal temperatures kept climbing despite continuous cooling operations. Officials later admitted the temperature gauge maxed out at 100 degrees, meaning they no longer knew the true heat level inside the tank. That changed the response immediately. Governor Gavin Newsom declared a state of emergency. Entire neighborhoods across Garden Grove, Anaheim, Cypress, and Stanton were evacuated. Schools closed. Roads were restricted. Families rushed into temporary shelters carrying pets, bags, medications, and whatever they could grab before leaving. Some shelters reached capacity within hours. At the same time, hazmat teams began preparing for failure scenarios instead of simply prevention scenarios. Crews built emergency containment barriers around the site in case thousands of gallons of MMA spill into drainage systems and local waterways. And while officials said a small crack discovered in the tank may be reducing pressure slightly, nobody is calling the situation stable, because the worst-case scenario remains catastrophic. The situation became far more serious politically once people realized where this was happening. GKN Aerospace is not just another California manufacturer. The company is involved in specialized production connected to the F-35 fighter jet program, including transparency and canopy systems tied to the aircraft. That immediately changes the stakes. Because the F-35 program runs on an extremely concentrated manufacturing network where highly specialized suppliers play oversized roles in the production process. And unlike ordinary consumer manufacturing, there are not dozens of easy backup facilities waiting to absorb delays overnight. This is especially sensitive right now because the F-35 program has already been under pressure to increase deliveries as NATO allies and Indo-Pacific partners continue expanding orders. Lockheed Martin delivered a record 191 F-35s in 2025 and has been trying to accelerate production for a growing list of allied customers. That means any prolonged disruption inside the supplier chain immediately creates nervousness about schedules, maintenance planning, and future delivery commitments, especially when many countries are already restructuring military planning around incoming F-35 fleets. And this is not a minor side program for the United States. The Pentagon still plans to buy more than 1,700 F-35s for the U.S. military alone, while allied demand continues growing across Europe and Asia. The aircraft has effectively become the backbone of America's next-generation allied air power strategy. That is why supplier disruptions matter so much. A canopy or transparency system is not something Lockheed Martin can simply replace with off-the-shelf parts from another factory within days. These are highly specialized, stealth-compatible components tied directly to aircraft certification, pilot visibility systems, and production sequencing. So when a facility connected to that chain suddenly sits inside an active hazmat emergency zone with explosion risks and evacuation orders, defense planners do not see it as a local California story anymore. They see another stress point hitting an already stretched military-industrial network. And the longer this emergency continues, the more expensive the situation potentially becomes. Recent F-35 production contracts have carried values exceeding $24 billion for fewer than 300 aircraft. That puts the production value per aircraft well above $80 million before long-term maintenance, software support, spare parts, and upgrade packages are added into the equation. So even temporary supplier instability can create wider financial consequences very quickly. A delay at one specialized facility may not stop the entire program immediately, but it can create bottlenecks that ripple across production sequencing and delivery coordination. And this is happening while parts of America's defense manufacturing system are already operating under heavy pressure. Defense contractors have spent the past year dealing with supplier bottlenecks, labor shortages, rising aerospace material costs, and growing pressure to accelerate production as allied military demand increases across Europe and the Indo-Pacific. The financial exposure becomes even larger when you consider how dependent the F-35 program already is on tight delivery schedules. Lockheed Martin's F-35 backlog now stretches across hundreds of aircraft for allied countries waiting to modernize their air forces. Analysts have estimated the lifetime value of the overall F-35 program at more than $1.7 trillion once sustainment and long-term support are included. That means even a relatively localized supplier disruption can suddenly create pressure far beyond California, especially if production delays begin affecting aircraft already scheduled for delivery to U.S. allies. Meanwhile, the danger on the ground remains real. Officials are still preparing for both explosion and spill scenarios. Crews continue spraying water around the clock, trying to cool the tanks. Investigators are examining whether the facility's own cooling systems failed before the emergency escalated. And legal pressure is now building rapidly. Class action lawsuits have already started. Local prosecutors opened investigations. Environmental concerns are growing around the possibility of contamination spreading through drainage systems into larger waterways.
One of the more interesting parts of this story is what is not being said publicly. Canadian officials are not openly attacking the F-35 program because of the California crisis. They do not need to. The images coming out of Garden Grove already speak for themselves. A major American defense supplier is sitting inside an active evacuation zone while firefighters fight to prevent a toxic industrial disaster. And that arrives during a period when Canada has already been reassessing long-term dependence on American systems across trade, energy, defense procurement, and critical supply chains. Ottawa officially committed to the F-35, but debates around sovereignty, operational flexibility, and supply chain resilience never fully disappeared inside Canada's defense conversation, especially after years of tariff disputes and political volatility under Trump. Now this emergency adds another real-world example to that discussion, because the issue is no longer theoretical. A local industrial failure in California is now raising questions across an international defense network tied directly to U.S. manufacturing reliability. That does not automatically mean Canada changes course, but it does reinforce why Ottawa increasingly prefers diversification, redundancy, and more strategic flexibility wherever possible.
The situation in Garden Grove remains unresolved. Hazmat crews are still monitoring the tanks. Evacuation zones are still active. Officials still cannot fully predict whether this ends with containment, a toxic spill, or something far worse. But the crisis already exposed how vulnerable highly centralized industrial systems can become when even one facility fails unexpectedly. And now, while emergency crews fight to stabilize the situation in California, governments waiting for F-35 deliveries are quietly watching something else unfold at the same time: America's defense supply chain stress test.
World leaders have had enough, and the newest mega trade bloc, led by the EU and India, has left Donald Trump completely on the outside. As nations pull back from Washington's volatility, Canada suddenly stands out as the dependable partner the world actually wants to work with. In a moment when alliances are being rebuilt from scratch, Ottawa is becoming a stabilizing force, while Trump pushes the United States into deeper isolation.
This isn't a symbolic snub. It's a realignment of global power where reliability matters more than rhetoric, and where middle powers like Canada are being pulled to the front of the room because great powers can no longer be trusted to hold it together. What's playing out now is not a diplomatic disagreement. It is a structural shift in who the world sees as credible.
In January 2026, U.S. President Donald Trump opened another front in his trade battles by threatening 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if Ottawa made a deal with China, a reference to the preliminary tariff arrangement on electric vehicles and agricultural products reached during Prime Minister Mark Carney's recent visit to Beijing. The escalation came on the heels of Carney's widely noted speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he argued that the post-Cold War order was not evolving, but rupturing, and that middle powers must deepen their cooperation to protect their interests in this new landscape. Tensions rose further when Trump publicly referred to Carney as the Governor of Canada, revoked an invitation for Ottawa to join his U.S.-led Board of Peace, and floated a new 50% tariff on Canadian aircraft imports linked to aviation certification disputes. Each move reinforced the message that Washington was prepared to pressure allies who stepped outside its preferred economic orbit.
While Trump escalated his rhetoric, world leaders were charting a different path. On January 27, the European Union and India finalized a major free trade agreement, creating a bloc representing billions of consumers and reshaping global trade flows without U.S. involvement. Across the Pacific, countries from the UK to Japan and Canada itself have been engaging with China through carefully managed, pragmatic economic channels. That trend has only strengthened as Trump's unpredictable tariff strategy deepens fractures in both transatlantic and transpacific relationships, pushing nations to seek new arrangements that insulate them from American volatility.
Prime Minister Carney's Davos remarks captured a pivotal moment. The architecture that held global cooperation together after the Cold War, long anchored by U.S. leadership, is coming apart, not through gradual transition, but through erratic geopolitics and the growing use of economic pressure as a weapon. In this environment, Trump's tariff threats cannot be viewed as isolated policy decisions. They function as signals, often crude ones, that ripple across global markets and political capitals. Whether aimed at Canada, South Korea, or tied to aircraft certification fights, the pattern is the same. Washington is prioritizing economic leverage over alliance stability. But instead of coercing partners into line, this approach has produced something very different. Nations are realigning collectively, seeking arrangements that reduce their dependence on any one power. The EU-India deal, expanded cooperation in Asia, and deepening ties with China are all signs that the old order is losing its pull, and that countries are building new networks they believe will serve them better.
For decades, Canada's economy has been tied closely to the United States, but the recent wave of tariff threats and geopolitical friction has pushed Ottawa to accelerate a shift it had already begun. The preliminary tariff agreement with China is a clear example. It lowers barriers on key Canadian exports like canola and eases duties on Chinese electric vehicles, signaling a pragmatic reset after several difficult years in the bilateral relationship. Carney's government has emphasized repeatedly that this is not a full free trade deal, nor does it violate any commitments under USMCA. Ottawa has no intention of negotiating a comprehensive FTA with Beijing. Instead, it is pursuing targeted technical measures that stabilize markets and open specific channels where Canadian exporters stand to benefit. But even with that careful framing, the political message is unmistakable. Canada will act independently when its economic security requires it. What Carney is proposing isn't a break from the United States, it's a recalibration. His point is that cooperation shouldn't depend on coercion, and that middle powers like Canada, Japan, South Korea, and several European states share a common challenge. They are trying to maintain stability in a landscape where major powers use economic tools to force alignment. Carney's strategy is to build a web of overlapping relationships with Europe, with the Indo-Pacific, with India, and ASEAN, so that Canada can hedge against sudden shocks from any single partner. The logic resonates beyond Canada's borders. Many countries no longer want to be pulled into the gravitational tug-of-war between Washington and Beijing. They are looking for flexible, resilient networks that allow them to trade, invest, and cooperate without becoming dependent. What is emerging is not a rebellion against any one power, but a more distributed global system where middle powers have far more room to shape the rules.
The U.S. response to these shifts has been mostly defensive. Trump's rapid pivots between threats and walkbacks have injected uncertainty into relationships that once relied on steady American leadership. As confidence erodes, some European governments and traditional Pacific allies are moving ahead with trade and investment talks with China and others, often without U.S. participation. Trump's portrayal of Canadian trade diversification as an act of betrayal reflects a foreign policy rooted in zero-sum thinking. But many nations are rejecting that logic. They are looking for arrangements that expand their options without surrendering sovereignty, and Canada is increasingly part of that conversation.
Canada's evolving approach does not signal an abandonment of the United States. The economic relationship remains deep, and no responsible government would walk away from such an integrated market. What Ottawa is doing instead is adjusting to a world where relying on one partner, even a close ally, carries real risks. In this environment, diversification is not a gesture of defiance, it's a form of protection. That shift is part of a broader global trend. Middle powers are stepping into roles that used to be overshadowed by superpowers. Agreements like the EU-India Pact, Canada's renewed openings with China, and expanding engagement with ASEAN show how countries are building their own networks, not waiting for Washington or Beijing to dictate the terms. Canada's diplomacy, steady, predictable, and grounded in long-term planning, stands in sharp contrast to the confrontational style coming from the United States. And this is where Trump's strategy may be backfiring. Every tariff threat, every public insult, every sudden policy reversal reinforces why countries like Canada are choosing to diversify. Rather than isolating Canada, Trump's tactics risk isolating the United States itself. Nations aren't banning America, but they are quietly reorganizing their alliances and supply chains so they no longer depend on U.S. stability. The takeaway is clear. Canada is positioning itself not as a replacement for the United States, but as a reliable player in a world that values consistency more than ever. And the more unpredictable American policy becomes, the more valuable that reliability will be.
The central question is no longer whether Canada can withstand Trump-era turbulence. It already is. The real question is whether Ottawa's evolving trade strategy becomes a model for how middle powers navigate a fractured international system. Is the United States driving the world into competing blocs or unintentionally knitting new blocs closer together? And can Canada's diversification approach set the standard for countries seeking balance between sovereignty and integration? This will be one of the defining challenges for Canada in 2026, with implications that stretch far beyond the border.